Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. This is Karma Bauman. We're going to be talking about Photoshop this morning. This is actually the second part of a webinar that I had done the first half of the Photoshop tools a few weeks ago. We will be finishing up an overview of those Photoshop tools this morning. Again, thank you for joining us. I appreciate each of you taking out time of your busy schedules to join us on these Friday morning webinars. A little bit about myself before we jump into the rest of the Photoshop tools. I've been using Photoshop for many years. I started using Photoshop in college and have continued to use it since then. And over the past probably 8 to 10 years, been focusing more on training others on how to use Photoshop. This is part of my giving back to the Photoshop community with these Friday morning webinars. Just a bit about logistics before we jump into the content of this morning. Below the video on your screen, you'll see a little form that you're welcome to fill out. If you have questions or comments as we go through this webinar, simply fill that form out, click send, and I will see that at my end and address any questions that might come up during the webinar. All right, with that, let's go ahead and get started with what I'm calling the second half of the Photoshop toolbar. Let me share my screen really quickly. So just a quick overview of what we'll be covering this morning. Continuing with how we did it the first part of this webinar a few weeks ago, I'll explain each tool. Again, we'll be starting about halfway through the Photoshop toolbar. And then I'll do a quick demonstration of how to use that tool, and also in the midst of that discuss when to use that tool. And then we'll wrap up with a list of additional resources that are available if you want to go a little bit deeper into each of these tools. And in addition to that, since I'm going through every tool in these two webinars, we'll be doing additional webinars where we're focusing on specific tools and how to really use each of those tools in a much deeper and in-depth way. Just a quick review of some of the things that we've covered up to this point. We started with an overview of the Photoshop desktop, kind of defining each of the different areas, and that's what this screen shows you. The last webinar and in this webinar focusing specifically on the toolbar, which is down the left-hand side of the Photoshop desktop. Just to kind of quickly divide these tools up into different use or areas of tools. The first several tools in the toolbar are the selection tools. Those are used to select different areas or aspects of a image or of your file. Then we have the crop and slice tools. Then we have a section of 5 to 6 tools that are called retouching tools, and we're going to jump into the middle of these retouching tools this morning. Tools that we can use to enhance or change different aspects in our images. Then we have the drawing and type tools, so we can add shapes, add text, add different kinds of elements to our images. We have document management tools. Those tools are used simply to navigate around our documents. The color selection tools used to, if we want to add shapes or add color to our images, we can use those tools to make the selection of colors. So we're going to start this morning with the eraser tool. We worked down through the eraser in our last webinar, so we'll start with that and then work down through each of the rest of the tools in the toolbar. So with that, let's jump into Photoshop. The eraser tool sits underneath the history brush tool, which is where we ended our last webinar. And as we discussed in our last webinar, each of these tools have what we call hidden tools underneath them. So if you click and hold on the tool, you'll see a little flyout that shows you the tools underneath that specific tool. The eraser tool is simply that. It's going to erase what's ever underneath my cursor at that time. So grab the eraser tool and simply click and start dragging. It's going to erase what's ever underneath it. So that's pretty much self-explanatory. Let's talk about some of the variations of the eraser tool. We have a background eraser tool. And that's useful if you want to remove, in this case, we're going to remove the sky, but we have these trees along the skyline there on the horizon. Instead of deleting the trees, we just want to delete the sky in the midst of those trees. We're going to use the background eraser tool to do that. And as we do that, the background eraser tool, you'll notice, has a little plus sign in the dead center of the cursor. That's my indicator of what color I want to erase. So as long as I keep the blue sky underneath that little plus sign in the center of my brush, it will only delete the shades of that blue color. So I'm going to click and hold on this, and you'll notice it only deletes just the sky, or the blue color. The trees remain. So even though the trees are within the cursor or within the brush, underneath my brush, it's not deleting that because it's only going to delete the color underneath the plus sign. So it's a great way to delete background color, if you will, behind objects that you might want to keep. And I can simply drag along this skyline to delete that, as long as I keep only the blue underneath the plus. So that's the background eraser tool. Let me go back to the original image. And let's discuss the one other variation of the eraser tool, and that's the magic eraser tool. If you're familiar with the magic wand tool, the magic eraser works similar to that. If I just simply click and drag up here in the sky area, it's going to delete those shades of blue within a certain, what we call, tolerance level. If you glance up in the control bar for this specific tool, you'll see a tolerance setting. I can increase or decrease that to make more or less of a selection. That didn't remove all of the sky because the shades of blue are greater than the 32 tolerance setting, but I can simply click on the rest of the sky and continue to delete that as well. And oftentimes you'll find you'll use a combination of tools to really get the effect that you want. So for example, I removed the sky here using the magic eraser tool. I do have some blue dots in here. I can make a selection and just delete that with the marquee tool. And then also down here in the sky where there's trees in front of it, I would use I would use the background eraser tool to delete that. Okay, so that's the eraser tool and the variations of the eraser tool. Yeah, there's a question about using the eraser tool and my use of that. I've used the background eraser tool in scenarios that I just explained, where I have objects within, where the color of the background is coming through other objects. I found that helpful. I really don't use the eraser tool a whole lot in the different editing photo editing techniques that I've done. If we move on to the next tool, we have the gradient tool. And the gradient tool is used to add gradients to our images. It also has some other uses which we'll go into in some future webinars. But to add a gradient to an image, the first thing we're going to do is actually make a selection and then apply the gradient inside that selection. If I don't make a selection and simply grab the gradient tool and click and drag, it's going to place a gradient over my entire image, which is probably what we don't want. I'm going to Control Z that out of there. Instead, we're going to make a selection first and then apply that gradient inside. So let's say I want to maybe eventually add a heading at the top of this image, and I'm going to want a gradient background behind it. So I'm going to grab the Marquee tool, which is a tool that we covered last time, and just grab the top part of this image. So now I have a selection. Now I go to my gradient tool. The gradient tool defaults from going to the foreground to background color. You'll notice it's black to white. If I glance up at the control panel here, which shows me the parameters for this gradient tool, click on that drop down. Those are the gradients I have available to me, or I can create new gradients as well. But for demonstration purpose, we'll just use the default settings. And as I click and drag across, it's applying the gradient to the entire area. If I drag all the way across, it's going to apply the gradient to the entire area. If I do a very short click and drag, it's going to place the beginning and ending colors to the left and right of my mouse clicks there. So it's a much shorter gradient, if you will. Okay, so the distance of what you drag will define how it applies the gradient inside that selection. You can also go top to bottom or bottom to top. You can also go from bottom left to top right as well. Yeah, if I went outside this selection, it will still only apply it inside the selected area. But usually you'll apply the entire gradient inside with the area that you've already selected. There's another question about applying the gradient. It will always start with, in this case, it's always starting with the foreground and making a gradient to the background color. And those are different options up here in the control panel. Right now it's doing a linear gradient. You have these other options that appear to apply different types of gradients, where it's a radial gradient, diamond gradient, etc. And those are all up here in the control panel. All right, that's the gradient tool. Let me back out of here, get back to our original image. We have some other tools underneath the gradient tool, and the one that we'll look at this morning is the paint bucket tool. I'm not looking at doing anything with 3D tools at this time. Maybe we'll do a webinar just focusing on 3D tools, so we'll only look at the paint bucket tool at this point. Paint bucket tool, similar to the gradient tool, you want to make a selection. Usually you'll make a selection first and then apply the paint bucket tool. If I don't make a selection, just simply click and drag. It's going to apply the paint bucket, in this case it's using the foreground color, which is black, to shades of the color that I clicked on as such. That's a more common way of using the paint bucket tool, is to make a selection. So let's just say for some reason I want to put a black circle or maybe an oval. Actually, let's do a square since I have that marquee tool selected. And now I grab my paint bucket tool and click inside that selection, and it will apply it inside that square. You'll notice it applied it to certain shades of the blue inside the selection that I had. And that's because there is a tolerance setting up here in the control panel for the paint bucket tool. I could increase that so it would fill up more of that area inside there. You can also change, by default, it paints the foreground color into your selected area. You could also choose to paint a pattern inside your selected area if you so desire. Let's go back to our original image. Moving on down in the toolbar, we now have these set of tools which are used more for finessing an image. Some of these are used more for portrait type images versus scenic images, which I have open here. But we can at least get a general idea of how these tools can be used. The blur tool is just that. And I think some of these tools, the question becomes, how do I actually use the tool? I understand blur, but how do I actually use that in an image? I'm going to change to, I think maybe I can show it on in this picture of lavenders. The blur tool will start to apply blur on every click of the mouse. So I'm going to select this particular flower, and the more I click on it, the blurrier it becomes. This one right here. If I click some more on that, you'll see that become blurrier and blurrier. So the multiple clicks will continue to apply the blur to it, so you can click it as often as you need to get the blur effect that you want. And this might be used, say you want to maybe focus on a specific item in your image, so you can blur everything else around it, so only the part that you want to focus on is really clear. Underneath the blur tool, we have the Sharpen tool, which is the exact opposite. So the flower that I just made very, very blurry, as I click on that, it will bring it back. So it's going to be this flower right here. I'm going to click on that. And it gets clearer and clearer. As such. Okay, so blur and sharpen kind of are the opposite of each other. Then underneath the Sharpen tool, we have the Smudge tool. I'm going to go to a different image to show you how the Smudge tool works. Let's go to this picture of a little girl here. I'm going to increase my brush size. By the way, I'm a fan of keyboard shortcuts. To increase my brush size here for the Smudge tool, I'm using the right bracket key. Left bracket makes it smaller. Right bracket makes it larger. And let's say I just want to smudge out this towel wrapped around this little girl. I don't know if you can see this through the video, but I'm clicking on the left side. There, yeah, I think you can see it in the video now. And just click and drag that out a little bit, and it applies a smudge to that area of the image. Yeah, and these tools, these three tools I've just talked about, the blur, the sharpen, and the smudge, they're more used for finessing an image. These aren't used as often as you would use some of the other tools, but when there's in a specific scenarios, these tools are very, very handy. Then underneath these tools, we have the dodge and burn tools, and those are very photographic type of terminology back from the darkroom days. And then a sponge tool. Let's review each of those. Let's start with the dodge tool. Again, the dodge tool and the burn tool kind of work in tandem, if you will. They do opposite effects. The dodge tool lightens an area, and the burn tool darkens an area. You often see these tools used, again, when you're working with portraits and lighting or darkening certain areas of the skin. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. And let's say I want to maybe lighten up the areas underneath this little girl's eyes. I can use the dodge tool to do so. Let me zoom in even more so you can see this better on the video. So I'm simply clicking underneath her eyes to lighten up that darker area. And again, you want to be very careful using these tools because you can apply too much really, really quickly. Whereas the opposite of the dodge tool is the burn tool, and it will darken the area. So if I just want to emphasize this a bit, on the other, if I continue to just click, it darkens those areas. Probably not the effect that we want specifically on this image, but you get the idea of how you can use the dodge and burn tools. Yeah, there's a question about using the dodge and burn tools on images and what type of images have I used it on. Usually it's mostly just with images of people and kind of in the same scenario where I want to lighten and darken certain areas of the skin. The burn tool could also be used if you want to apply it like a shadow effect. You can darken aspects of your image to get a similar result by using the burn tool. And then the other tool underneath the set of tool is the sponge tool. A sponge tool is used to either saturate or can also be used to desaturate an area of your image. Let's go back to this image of the Animas River, and let me get a bigger brush here. I have my sponge tool selected, and if I glance up in the control panel for this tool, I notice it's set to desaturate, so it's going to remove color. Actually, let me go to this picture of the little girl here on the towel wrapped around her. So I'll give you a better demonstration of this tool. And I'm going to simply click on the towel that's wrapped around this little girl. And as I click on it, you're going to notice everything goes, in that particular area, it's going to go to black and white because it's taken the color out of that area. You can also apply this using it as a brush too. As you click, the more you click on it, the more it desaturates. Let's do the opposite of that. Still, I can still using the Smudge Tool. If I change my mode in my control panel to saturate, it's going to apply more color to the area. Let's see if you can get that. Yeah. As I click and drag in this area of the towel wrapped around the little girl, you can see it saturates that with the more of the blue or aqua color. So that's saturate and desaturate using the Smudge Tool. Underneath the Smudge Tool in the toolbar, we have the infamous Pen Tool. The Pen Tool certainly has a learning curve to it. I'll demonstrate using it. We'll probably spend a whole webinar on explaining really how to use the Pen Tool. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to go to a new document. The Pen Tool is great if you want to do some just kind of a free-form selection, if you will, so it's not a specific geometric shape. Or if you want to add some kind of shape to your image, the Pen Tool is great. And it's a very, very useful tool once you master on how to use the Pen Tool. And the trick of using the Pen Tool is connecting the dots, if you will. I'm just going to simply click and make a couple points, and by default the Pen Tool just connects those points as you see demonstrated here, and there's no curvature in the lines. It's just straight lines from one point to another. I'm going to Control Z those out of there. Instead of just clicking and it by default drawing a line from one point to another, if I click and drag, I'm defining how I want this line to come out of that point. And notice now it's making curves from one point to another. You also see these additional what we call handles appear, and that's helping to visually show you the direction of the line coming out of that point. So notice right now on the point I just added, the handle on the right is going up, which defines how the line is going to proceed out of that point. So if I click and drag down on the next line, notice the line coming out of the previous point is going up. And when I added this point, I dragged down, so the line coming out of this point is going to be going down when I apply the next point. As such. Now these handles will give you the option to change a direction if you needed to do that. We're not going to get in depth with that at this point or in this webinar. But that's how the Pen Tool works. It's a click and drag to define the direction of the line coming out of that point. If I want to end or close this shape, I simply click on my beginning point to close that. Yeah, there's a question about using the Pen Tool and the learning curve in it. It does take a while to learn how to use the Pen Tool, and we'll spend some time in a future webinar maybe going through some finer techniques on how to use the Pen Tool so you can make your selections better. Underneath the Pen Tool, we have various aspects of the Pen Tool to add points or delete points. We also have what we call a Freeform Pen Tool. I'll come back to the Freeform Pen Tool. Let's go to the Add Anchor and Delete Anchor Point tools. If I select that tool underneath the Pen Tool, this is the add anchor point to a shape. When I hover over my line that I already drew, or the shape that I already drew, and click, it's going to add a point there. And then I can also grab either the handles to define how I want the curvature of that line to appear. Okay, so adding a point does just that. Click where you want to add the point on your line, and then you can navigate how you want those those lines to come out of that point. Whereas the reverse of that would be the delete anchor point tool. This is to remove points, if you will, or anchors from your shape. Simply click on one of the anchor points there and it will delete that anchor point. There's another variation of the pen tool that we notice here called Convert Point Tool. What that will do is that will take a curve and make it into what we call just a straight line. So if I click on one of these points, instead of a nice curve happening, it's going to turn that into more of a square point, as you see right here. Okay. And yeah, I seldom use that aspect of the pen tool. Usually I'll just use the regular pen tool to do these variations. I'm going to come back to the Freeform Pen Tool. Let me maybe do a new document to demonstrate that really quick. I've selected the Freeform Pen Tool, and that is simply as it described. You can simply click and drag to create your shape. And it's going to add anchor points in there for you. So instead of clicking to create each anchor point, I just click and drag and it will add the anchor points as needed. But usually I will use just the regular pen tool if I'm using anything with the pen tool. I delete that. All right, moving on down the toolbar, the next tool is the text tool. Let's go back to one of our images and add some text to it. You can do a lot of fun things with the text tool. We'll just use the basic aspect of using the text tool in this webinar, but we can spend some time with the text tool in a future webinar. To use the text tool, I'm going to grab it in my toolbar. Again, in the control panel are the settings for the toolbar. You can select the font, the size, etc. I'm going to simply click and start typing. Bring my point size down a little bit to, let's say, and there's the heading for my image. I just clicked and started typing. You can also, when you're using the pen tool, you can click and drag to define the area of what you want your text to be inside of instead of just going straight across. Let's use a smaller font here, and we'll say keep this here. So notice it's going to stay inside that area. I have some settings here where the text is overlapping. Let me change these really quick to do something like this. Yeah. So you can just simply click and type away, and it will just type your text straight across. Or if you click and drag, you define the text area, and it will keep the text within that area when you're using the text tool. I'm going to get rid of that layer. Then there's variations of the text tool. By default, it's still horizontal, so it's going to type it across. You have an option to do a vertical type tool, which will type it down the page, like so. And this might be useful if you just want to do a heading on the left or right side of an image to define it versus a horizontal text. To be honest, I haven't used that version of the text tool a whole lot. Then we have these two other variations of the text tool underneath the regular text tool called the vertical type mask and horizontal type mask. The only difference in these, of course, is the vertical versus horizontal, but let me demonstrate how we might use either of these mask tools. I'm going to go with a horizontal mask tool. Let me also get rid of my first text layer. The horizontal mask tool can be used if you want to, say, put your picture inside your text. So for demonstration purposes, I'll use my lavender image. And I'm just going to type across here. and make that much smaller. So I typed the word flower. It turned into orange because that's the default of a mask tool behavior. And I can move this around a little bit. There we go. I'm going to accept that, and it's going to make this selection via the text I typed in there, which right now says flower. And I can do various things with this. For now, I'm just going to add another layer with the word and the image inside that word. So I'm going to do a copy. So it's going to copy whatever's inside of my selection, which right now is the word flower. I'm going to add another layer and do a paste. So add another layer here. You can't see it yet because it's right directly in that image. Grab my move tool and move this a little bit. And you can see a little bit now in the video where the content of what I'd copied shows up. Let me add some effects here so it stands out even more. Like so, and you might maybe add another stroke in here. Let me add one more thing here. And make it smaller, like so. Okay, so the mask variation of the type tool can be used to put your image inside your text field. There's other uses as well. We could also just turn off that back layer and turn off our effects or not. Don't look like so. Okay, so that's the use of the type mask tool. Let's go back to the original image. Then underneath the type tool, we have what we call the direct selection tool and the selection tool. And this again is, both of these tools are used if you're working with shapes. And I'm going to go back to the this pen drawing that we did earlier and demonstrate to you how to use the selection tool and the direct selection tool with this pen drawing that we did earlier. The selection tool, let me make sure I have the right variation, the path selection tool, can be used to actually move this shape around. So if I click on the path itself, notice I have to click on the path to select it, then click and drag and move the entire shape. If I'm just over here in the white area, it will not move it with a selection tool. So click on the path and it will grab the entire shape and move it. The variation of that tool is what we call the direct selection tool. And this is used to grab a point along a path. So for example, I'm just going to click on this point, and now if I click and drag, it's only going to move that point around. So I'm not moving the entire selection, I'm just moving a point on that path. You can also, by default, it's going to select one point. If I want to maybe move two points around, I click on the first point and then shift click on the second point. And now when I, whoops, that didn't, there we go. And now I can click and drag multiple points around. So that's the selection tool, or the path selection tool, and the direct selection tool. And used most often when you're working with shapes. Here's a question about that. Would you use that on just an image? And you probably would not unless you put a shape over your image. Then you want to move that shape around or finesse that shape a bit. You might use these two tools, but you really won't use it on a shape, on the image itself. The one that you probably use is just the regular move tool to move the entire image around, or a selection of that image. So these are more shape specific type of tools. All right, moving on to the next tools, we have our shape tools right underneath that. And let's go back to an image to demonstrate the shape tools. And these are pretty much self-explanatory. There's some keyboard shortcuts I'm going to mention as you use these tools to help create specific geometric shapes. The rectangle tool, you simply click and drag to create your rectangle. It's going to by default fill in with the foreground color. So you can always change that if you wanted to up here in the control panel to a different color. A variation of that would be, I have the rectangle shape tool and I want to make a square. If I hold down Shift before I click and drag, it retains my shape as a square. Then you have your different types of shapes underneath the rectangle tool. The rounded rectangle will give you the rounded corners. Ellipse tool will do the ovals or the circles if you hold down Shift. The Polygon tool, let's take a look at that. When I select the Polygon tool and glance at my control bar at the top, this is where I set the number of sides for the Polygon tool. So if I say 6 sides, plug the 6 in there, just click and drag, and there's my polygon. Now there's variations of the Polygon tool which are good to be aware of. If I click on this little gear icon, which are the settings for this tool, I have some options here to either do the smooth corner so I don't have the straight edges. I also can do a star. If I click on that, I still have my 6, in this case I still have my 6 sides selected. I'll have a 6 pointed star. Okay, so that's how you can get the star shape using the Polygon tool, is to select the check the settings underneath the gear icon and turn on the star option. And underneath the shape tool we have the line tool, and one of the parameter settings for the line tool is to add arrow at the line. Again, you go to the gear icon to turn that on or off. There's the line tool. And then finally we have the custom shape tool, which is the last selection under this tool. And when you select the custom shape tool, up in the control panel, you'll have this drop down of different shapes that you can choose from. Starburst, copyright symbol, check mark, so all kinds of different types of shapes or icons, if you will, that you can use with the custom shape tool. Yeah, and these will default to filling in with your foreground color. I have a question about that. Let me change my foreground color here to something else before I draw with that custom shape tool. And we'll do the heart, like so. And you'll notice with this shape tool, now I could go back and use my direct selection tool and drag out any of these points if I wanted to. So you can tweak the custom shape after the fact if you like to. All right, let's move on to our next tool. We have just maybe 5 more minutes here. Let's revert back to our original image. Now we're getting down into what we call the document management tools. So to navigate within a document, especially if you're doing a lot of close-up work. So to demonstrate this next tool, which is the hand tool, I'm going to zoom in here on this particular image. I've selected my hand tool. As I click and drag with my hand tool, it moves the entire image around my desktop. So if I need to get to a different part of an image, I can just simply click and drag. The keyboard shortcut for the hand tool is a space bar. I seldom actually click on the hand tool, but if I'm doing something else, if I'm in another tool and I need to move the document around, I simply press my space bar to get to my hand tool and then release, and it goes back to my tool that's currently selected. So the hand tool is very handy if you're doing close-up work and need to move around in your image. Underneath the hand tool, one of the hidden tools underneath that is the rotate view tool, and does simply that. It's going to rotate this image as such. Underneath the hand tool, we have the zoom tool, which you're probably pretty familiar with. The zoom tool is simply that. You can zoom into a part of your image or zoom out. To do the zoom out option, when using the zoom tool, you have to hold down either the Option key on a Mac or an Alt key on a Windows to zoom out. Go back to my rotate, see if I can get this straightened up a bit. As such. And again, the keyboard shortcut, there's a question about the keyboard shortcut for the zoom tool. And again, I use a keyboard shortcut more often than the actual zoom tool. Control plus zooms in, Control minus zooms out. Then underneath what we call document management tools are the color selection tools. We do have a little icon here, looks like an ellipse. That has to do with some presets for the toolbar. I'm going to skip over that one for now. Below that we have color selection. So this is where we set our foreground and background colors. And these come into play whenever we add text or shape to our image. It's going to fill up that shape or the text with our foreground color. The background color you won't see in action, if you will, as often. But if I was to expand or make this image, the canvas, larger, it would fill in the area outside the image with the background colors. To demonstrate this, let's do just that. I'm going to go up to my image option of the main menu, go to my canvas size. It's going to pop up this canvas size dialog window, and let's increase this. Let's say I'm going to go 3500, 2500. Oops. And it added more canvas area around my image, and the color it used for that canvas was my background color. That's how the background color is used. Again, that doesn't come into play near as often as your foreground color. And finally, we have two more tools underneath. Let me mention one other thing about the color selection tool. We have this right above where we choose the foreground and background color. By the way, you simply click on either of those color boxes and then make your selection there to change the foreground or background color. Notice it does not change. I changed my background to a black from white. It did not change my canvas area. It only applies in the next change, so it won't change what you currently have on in your image or in your document, but any additional items that you add. So if I was to increase my canvas size again, it would show up as black. And finally, the two remaining tools underneath the color selection area. We have what we call a quick mask tool, and that has to do with making selections. And we'll spend a lot more time with how to make selections in a future webinar, but just to demonstrate this really quickly, I'm going to grab a brush tool and then turn on my quick selection tool, or my quick edit mask tool. What this does is it makes a selection, and your selection is going to be indicated as you brush across your image. It's going to paint orange. So let's say I want to select, this is not a good selection at all, but just for demonstration it will show you. So I'm selecting the sky very, very roughly. I'm going to click on my quick edit mask tool again, and notice it's made a selection. It's actually made a selection of everything except for what I painted on here. I'm going to do Control-Shift-I to inverse that. Now it's just the sky here. Then I could, I don't know, just press delete here. And let me grab my pop-up window here. And when I delete this, we'll just fill it with foreground color for demonstration purposes, like such. Okay. Let's revert back to the original image, get rid of that. So that's a quick edit mask mode, and again, we'll do more with that later on. And then finally, at the very last tool at the bottom of the Photoshop toolbar is the option to change screen mode. This is helpful if you want to get a clearer picture of your image of how it looks. And get rid of all this busyness around here that's in Photoshop. You can use this tool. Right now we're in this what we call the standard screen mode. Notice also when I click and hold on this to show the other options of this specific tool, the keyboard shortcut shows out here to the right, so I'm going to use that. The keyboard shortcut is F. So now I press F, it gets rid of some of the desktop. If I press F again, it gets rid of everything and places the image against a black background. This is great if you're doing some work in front of a client. You want to show them how it looks without all the busyness of Photoshop. Simply press F a couple times to get to this screen mode. I'm going to press F again to get back to the regular mode. All right, so that wraps up the tools in the Photoshop toolbar. We've gone through all of the tools. Again, if you missed the first part, check. I'll send out a link of this recording, and on that same link, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see the recording from the last webinar that we did that covered the first half of the Photoshop toolbars. Any other questions or comments before I wrap up this morning? Yeah, there's a question about how to use some of these tools. I think the next webinar, I'm not going to be looking at a specific tool and demonstrating a specific tool, but I do have plans to look at these tools in depth in a future webinar as well. And watch your emails. I will be sending out a notice for next week's webinar and what that will be covering. All right, so if there's no other questions, we'll wrap up for today. Let me go back to stop screen share. Again, thanks for joining us. Check back next week. We'll be covering more aspects of Photoshop. Let me jump back to my slideshow really quickly. I'm going to mention a few more resources, and I'll include these links in the recording that goes out so you don't have to remember these resources. Adobe has a great resource explaining each of the tools. It does a good job of just explaining how the tool can be used. It's probably one of the most helpful resources I found as far as the use of the tools inside Photoshop. You can always do a Google search for using Photoshop tools. Then there's this other link on sitepoint.com that does a great job of not only covering the tools, it covers some other aspects of getting started in Photoshop. I also have some free Photoshop videos available to you on this last link on this slide on my own site, onwardstudios.com. Again, I will post these links underneath the recording. If you go to the free Photoshop videos link on my site, you'll sign up. Sign up and you'll get 6 free Photoshop videos covering different aspects of Photoshop. Actually, what these 6 different videos cover are the top 6 questions from Photoshop beginners. I think it includes things like how to make a selection, how to remove red eye, how to crop an image, those types of editing techniques. Also, I'm putting together a new course in using Photoshop, which probably won't be out for a number of months yet. I do have an older Photoshop course available on my site. You can go to this link, Photoshop Online Training on onwardstudios.com to get that. I think right now I'm offering that for like $27, so you're welcome to jump in on that. And it's using an older version of Photoshop, but I reviewed what's inside this course, and everything still applies to the current version as well. So you're welcome to check that out. And I believe that wraps it up. I also have a YouTube channel. You're welcome to check out the Onward Studios YouTube channel to see different videos of using Photoshop. You'll see a lot of WordPress videos in that channel as well. And I do have a blog that you can jump to. If you go to where you can select a category, select the Photoshop category, and you'll see other tutorials as well. Get a hold of me at my email, karma@onwardstudios.com. You can also check out the website. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, and as I mentioned, on YouTube. All right, that wraps this one up. I'll be back again next week, Friday morning at 8, talking again about Photoshop. I do this on the 3rd and 4th Fridays of each month, and on the 1st and 2nd Fridays, we discuss different aspects about WordPress. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great weekend.